So thank you very much for the invitation to talk to you. I've chosen misinformation about net zero, and I only have 15 minutes in total, so it's not a comprehensive review of the subject. I'm going to give you some examples. Uh, but I have a general theme. Let me just explain what my role is. So I'm Policy and Communications Director of the Grantham Research Institute. So I oversee our engagements with so-called non-research audiences, which means that everybody who isn't a researcher, including policymakers, the media, the public. I've been there for 15 years, and one of the things I've been doing is tackling some of the worst cases of misinformation, which unfortunately it changes characteristic, but it's always there in the background, and we still have an enormous problem. And what I'm going to do today is explain how we've seen a big increase in misinformation, in the amount of misinformation since the Uxbridge by-election in July 2023. And my argument is that our democracy is being undermined by a handful of newspaper editors and politicians who are putting an adherence to a rigid ideology ahead of the public interest by promoting falsehoods about policies to cut greenhouse gas emissions and net zero. And it's hard not to reach the conclusion that the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was bounced into weakening policies to tackle climate change in September 2023 by this misinformation campaign from some Conservative MPs and parts of the print and broadcast media. And I argue that the British public have the right to accurate information so that they can make well-informed decisions about whether to support climate policies or indeed any policies at national and local level. But unfortunately, some newspapers, broadcasters and politicians are trying to deprive the British public of this democratic right by trying to fool them about the issue. So my cover slide there is a picture of Donald Trump. This was during the eclipse, solar eclipse in the United States in 2017. Donald Trump doing the one thing you were told not to do. Stare with your naked eye at the eclipse. And that pretty much sums up. I mean, Trump is one of the worst purveyors of misinformation at the moment, but he is by no means the only one. And we have plenty of homegrown UK sources of misinformation. And I'm going to use as an example an editorial in the Sunday Telegraph, which managed to cram in so much misinformation, it probably is a record holder. It was a leading article, no doubt written by the editor, who is a self-confessed climate change skeptic, as he would describe it, although he'll buy any falsehood that matches his ideological beliefs. This particular editorial ran on the 23rd of July, so just a few days after the Uxbridge result. And I'm going to go through some of the falsehoods in this and just identify the examples. So at the top are the quotes, actual quotes from the article. This one is, even by the standards of her dismal premiership, making net zero legally binding by 2050 must count among Theresa May's very worst acts. The provision passed through Parliament with practically no debate. One of the most momentous political decisions in modern British history was nodded through with very little thought. Well, that's just not true. It was debated twice in both houses. It included a report on secondary legislation. This was an amendment to the Climate Change Act. So it was the subject of a report and a memorandum, and MPs participated. Now, admittedly, the debates were not as long as you get on some issues, say Rwanda and immigration, but nevertheless, the claim that it was nodded through without any thought and discussion is simply not true. That's the House of Commons, the two debates and the explanatory memorandum that was made available to politicians. This is the House of Lords, the two debates, and the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee report on it. So the Sunday Telegraph is just plain wrong about this. fact. And moving on to their one of their other claims, by mandating net zero by an arbitrary date, by embracing bans and restrictions, by lavishing the green industry with subsidies, they are engaging in economic and societal destruction on an extraordinary scale. Now, just that sentence has so many inaccurate and misleading claims in it. I'm not going to deal with all of them, but let's just deal with the question of whether net zero by 2050 is an arbitrary date. And remember, arbitrary means you've just plucked it out of the air. It wasn't plucked out of the air. It was based on a very detailed report by the Climate Change Committee, of which Piers, of course, is now leads, that set out very clearly what the case was for net zero by 2050, and it drew attention to this was the CCC's report was published in May 2019, ahead of the bill being introduced in Parliament, of course. But it also drew attention to a report that was published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in October 2018 that was explicit that if we wanted to have a reasonable chance of limiting warming to no more than 1.5 degrees, that we would need to reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions globally by 2050. And on that basis, there was a clear case for the UK setting its net zero target for all its emissions by 2050. So again, the idea that it's an arbitrary date is also simply false. Okay. Then said, heat pumps look likely to be the next scandal, an expensive technology totally inappropriate for many British homes. Well, you may know that the biggest distribution of heat pumps at the moment are in the Scandinavian countries, famously warm countries that have no problems heating their homes. Well, of course, it's just complete nonsense, and it is against the evidence. So this report on the right here is by the was published by the Energy Systems Catapult that had actually gone out and looked at people's houses and looked at whether they could install heat pumps, and they reached the conclusion just at the bottom. The project has not identified any particular type or age of property that cannot have a successful heat pump installation. The suggestion that there are particular home archetypes in Great Britain that are unsuitable for heat pumps is not supported by the project data, or indeed by any evidence. It's a false claim. Okay. The 2030 deadline for banning new diesel and petrol cars is fast approaching, with no obvious effort being put into ensuring that there will be the charging infrastructure or electricity production capacity required to run them. Well, if only they had Googled the National Grid's website, they would have found this interesting busting the misconception about electric vehicles, which dealt with both of those, showing that not only is there going to be enough electricity capacity, it says here, even if we all switch to electric vehicles overnight, we estimate demand would only increase by around 10%. So we'd still be using less power as a nation than we did in 2002. And this is well within the range the grid can capably handle. So the experts clearly stating that's not true. They also point out all the work that's going into creating a charging infrastructure. So the idea that there's no obvious effort being put into that is also utterly false. Okay. Just making sure. Okay. Sunday Telegraph, final statement. Where is the cost benefit analysis of net zero by 2050? Well, they could have read the report by the CCC and found a lot of analysis here of the costs and benefits, pointing out that actually reaching net zero by 2050 will probably involve the same level of investment as we thought would be involved in getting to an 80% reduction in emissions originally when we set the original target. The Office for Budget Responsibility examined the central case that the CCC had laid out and showed that essentially by the middle of, within the next 10, 15 years, the net benefits, the net savings from the transition to net zero will be bigger than the net investment costs. And so if the OBR had not arbitrarily stopped in 2050 and then continued the benefits on, you would eventually reach a net benefit overall over the entire time scale. As it is, they calculated that there was a net cost of about 300 billion spread over 30 years, which is not which is less than 1% of GDP. So again, the Sunday Telegraph simply not telling the truth. Going to just end with, it's not just the media. We have a political party in Reform UK who have mainstreamed climate change denial into their campaign. This is from their website. It's got, again, this is good old-fashioned climate change denial where they argue with the science, not just the policies. Warming has, of course, taken place over the last approximately 150 years, with signs over recent years that it is now levelling off. Well, have a look at the graph in the top right-hand corner. That's annual average temperature. I don't see levelling off. There are some, maybe there might be some statisticians in the room who can say, yes, that is levelling off. That's clearly levelling off. It's just not true. And then through here, let's take out the Arctic sea ice cover has increased since the low point in 2012 and is very close to 30-year average levels. Well, that's the graph in the bottom right-hand corner of Arctic sea ice. That looks to me like a fairly clear downward trend. I mean, you could probably convince yourself that every 3 or 4 years you see a levelling off and then a big drop, but that would be doing it wrongly, wouldn't it? So this party has mainstreamed it into their policies, and we should beware of a party which is potentially holding the balance of power in the next general election, campaigning on they want a referendum to net zero and they don't accept the science of climate change. Thank you very much indeed.
All right. Excellent, thank you. Questions?
An observation. When I last worked with the Telegraph, Lord Black, a Tory peer, was the editorial director. Is it possible that this is part of a Tory campaign to win an election or to lose it less harshly on the basis of being an anti-net zero party?
Yeah, so the Telegraph, and I used to work as a science reporter at the Telegraph a long time ago, and things have changed quite a lot since then. But they have been campaigning against climate change policies for a long time. After Uxbridge, which the Conservatives managed to avoid massive defeat, and that I think they equated with victory, decided that being anti-environmental would be a successful path. All I can say is since Rishi Sunak announced the weakening of climate change policies in September, his poll ratings have got worse, not better. So if it was the strategy, it doesn't work. And the majority of the public, when you survey them, want action on climate change. So I think the Telegraph are just kind of pretending that the world is something different.
There was one candidate, Ed Gilmore, who founded the Climate Change Party.
Yes.
Who got 49 votes.
Yeah. Well, I think the idea that you would vote in any general election on one issue, right? Again, the public expects you to have a range of issues. But we have the mainstream party. I mean, despite the slowing down of policy, the Prime Minister remains currently committed, he says, to our legally binding Climate Change Act. He doesn't want to repeal it at the moment. But we'll see. We have been in position before with this party shaving votes off the Conservatives and demanding a referendum about an issue, and we saw where we ended up with that. So unfortunately, I don't think we can rule out the possibility that this current Conservative Party might be forced into conceding they want a referendum on net zero as well.
Okay.
So, very quickly, focusing on the UK, not the rest of the world, the way I view it is, from what I can recall, the top 10 temperatures ever recorded since something like the 1870s in the UK, 9 have occurred in the last 25-ish years. You don't need to be a statistician to see there's a bias from 9 out of 10 or in that category.
Well, I think that the 10 warmest years have occurred since 2002, I think. That's right, Piers? Yeah, in the UK. Yeah.
Well, okay. the underlying point remains the same.
Yeah.
About 150 years of recording
Yeah.
temperatures, and you can argue it's 25 years, 20 years. I'm not going to worry about that.
Yeah.
But also, you look at in the last few years the amount of floods and diversity of the floods across the UK. These are factual things that are occurring. So my question to you would be, what would you propose, or what do you think can be done in the communication line to reverse the trend based on fact? Because fact is your asset.
Well, so how do I make government policy more evidence-based? Well, if I had that solution, I'd probably be a very rich man. I look. The transition is difficult, right? We've done the easy stuff, mainly getting coal off the grid. We've got more challenges in the way, and some of this is going to be difficult, involving difficult conversations, for instance, around agriculture, etc. But these are things we can do, and the alternative is so awful that unfortunately there's only one option. What we do know is trying to go slow, as the UK seems to, or this current government seems to want, is not a very good strategy, because it means that the economic opportunities associated with the new technologies essentially get seized by our economic competitors, and they get all the benefits, including of new markets. So it's not a sensible strategy either way, let alone from environmental point of view. And some people make the argument, well, UK's emissions are less than 1% of the globe, so it doesn't matter what we do. Well, those same people make the argument that the UK is an influential place. In fact, they argue it's much more influential than the rest of the world realizes. Well, if we're so influential, we should be using our influence to help persuade other countries to be more ambitious. We aren't going to do that by being slower ourselves. We have to be ambitious. We can then persuade others that they should be ambitious.
Okay. Two more quick questions, Merle.
Yeah, well,
Nathan.
we have a rabid anti-climate change press. How do you counter that? What's your strategy? How do we get a good message out?
Well, look, I've been spending a good part of my career playing whack-a-mole and with inaccurate misleading. The trouble is, since Uxbridge, the volume of misinformation is so overwhelming that you just can't do it. The only way we're going to make progress, I'm afraid, is by having reform of our media regulatory process, which is basically a shambles at the moment, because David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, decided he couldn't stand implementing the whole of the Leveson inquiry's recommendations. So we currently have self-regulation in the newspapers, which allows some newspapers to join this group called the Independent Press Standards Organisation. Some are just doing their own thing. But the Independent Press Standards Organisation is not enforcing rules. The Sunday Telegraph is a member of IPSO. I complained about that article. They said all of those statements that are wrong are just a matter of opinion and therefore allowed by press standards. In my view, that's not what the public expect.
Okay, one last quick question.
Bob, you spend quite a bit of your life
Too much.
in the studios of GB News.
Yes.
And you know, we in the session before you came, we talked about you know, the whole kind of question of the perception that people like you and lots of people like us are basically captured by the inverted commas deep state. Do you hear that?
I'm captured by what?
You're captured by the deep state.
Oh, the deep state. Well, I mean,
so do you hear that in your studio encounters and how do you handle that? How do you tackle that?
yeah. So some people say, why bother going on GB News? They reach a proportion of the population, not a majority, but a small proportion of the population, who need to be engaged in the debate, and they need to hear something other than the regular nonsense from their presenters. When you go to GB News, I have to say there are happy people there. I mean, they're a lot happier than the BBC. We're not going to BBC, everybody's miserable. GB News, yeah, well, exactly. But anyway, so they are, and all very friendly and everything, so it's no point demonising them, but they are very ideological. And there's something very interesting about being interviewed by a Conservative MP who's had no training as a journalist, because it's not so much an interview as an exchange of views. And I've been on with Jacob Rees-Mogg, congratulated him on his knighthood, he was beaming his head off, etc. But he then started talking about all the subsidies in that go to green energy. And so we spent £78 billion in the last 2 years of government money subsidising consumers who couldn't afford the high price of natural gas. 78 billion. It would have been a better idea if we'd used that money to help people insulate their homes and get off natural gas quicker, because that would have been a long-lasting guard against it. So the problem with these arguments that are based on ideology is you have to confront them with reality and say, you know, much as with Liz Truss's speech at CPAC, completely in Gaga land, disconnected from reality. And we're going to have to keep confronting them with the reality, because this does really matter. People do genuinely die. We have thousands of deaths every year from heat in this country because we are not doing it properly. We have got increasing damage from floods. We're exposed as every other country to the impacts around the world, including increased migration from countries that are going to be hit by impacts. That's something they should care about. Thank you.
Thank you.